Trevor Jackson Podcast.
What's poppin' with y'all, man, on this beautiful day? You know, we still celebrating Black History Month. I feel as if it's important to be knowledgeable about the past, to be seeking information and learning things that happen to our people and to people in general. Because, like, if you don't know where you've been, if you don't know what your lineage had to fight through, you just got to be aware. This episode is a perspective for awareness. That's all. I might say some crazy things. I might give a take that you disagree with, but I would like, if you do disagree with it, to get in the comment section and teach me and educate me. So, we already talked about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and I made a video about Thomas Sowell and Dr. Claude Anderson. But I was watching this today. You know, me and my wife was just chilling. We had dinner or whatever. She was reading her book. I was reading my book. You know that we are readers in this household and we like to read. And then after that, we was full just chilling and I just put this video on. I looked at 2-3 minutes of this video. I turned it off. I said, I need to talk with the family about this. The slaves America never freed. You know, they call this country the land of the free, the home of the brave. But are we really free? Now, you know, I've been talking about laws, rules, and regulations and how I respect laws, rules, and regulations. It's needed. It's even in the Bible about laws, rules, and regulations. Obey the law of the land. That's a scripture in the Bible. But are you really free when there's consequences to your actions? Do you really have free will? Is that a such thing that God gave us free will? We can do whatever we want to. But with the laws, the rules, and the regulations, it's consequences. Now, I'm going to play this video and we're going to get into the conversation. Thank y'all for tuning in. Make sure you hit the like button so you can help me trigger the algorithm so this message can get out to the masses. Make sure you share the show. Leave a comment so we can further the discussion. You know, thank y'all for participating into the creativity. We celebrating us, man. Let's go. And if you ain't black, you know, when I go to the African American Museum, I see more people that don't look like us. When I go to the Harvey B. Gantt Center, the arts festivals and all of that that's specifically for black people, I see more people that don't look like us. So if you here and you learning, say something, man. I would like to hear your voice and see what your interest is. Let's get into it, though. Let's get into the conversation. Let's go. Let's go.
It was a hot spring day in Alabama as Green Cottonham walked the familiar path home. He was 22, born to parents who remembered the taste of slavery. Now he was making his way back from visiting family, following the tracks like countless other travelers in the South. A sheriff's deputy appeared on the horizon. In seconds, Green's life changed forever. The charge? Vagrancy, a crime invented after the Civil War with a simple definition: being black and unemployed. Within days, he was sentenced to hard labor in the coal mines of Alabama. Green Cottonham disappeared into slope number 12 of the Pratt Mines, working for U.S. Steel Corporation. He never saw his family again. And this was in 1908, over 40 years after slavery was supposedly abolished in America. But this was just another casualty in a system that was supposed to have ended already. So, you're sitting in history class, learning about how Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves and how America moved past its darkest chapter. But what if I told you that's not where the story ends? What if I told you that for decades after the Civil War, hundreds of thousands of black Americans were forced back into chains through a system that was arguably worse than slavery itself? This isn't some conspiracy theory. This is the story of how America's most powerful industries and government officials worked together to create a new form of slavery, one that would persist well into the 20th century, a system so profitable that it helped build some of the largest companies we know today. but also insanely brutal that even former slave owners admitted it was worse than slavery. This is the story of how slavery never really ended in America. April 9th, 1865. After 4 bloody years of civil war that pit North against South, the Confederate states surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. The Union, the northern states fighting to preserve the country, had defeated the Confederate states that broke away to protect slavery. With the Union's victory, 4 million Black Americans were finally freed from their chains. Or at least, that's how the story goes in your history books. This wasn't just a military victory either. It was meant to be a complete transformation of American society. With the approval of the 13th Amendment in December 1865, followed by the 14th Amendment in 1868, Black Americans were finally considered as citizens with constitutional rights. The 15th Amendment in 1870 guaranteed their vote. They called it Radical Reconstruction. The federal government stationed 38,000 troops across the South. This military presence enabled an unprecedented transformation. By 1870, over 1,000 Black politicians were serving in state and federal offices. Think about this. Just 5 years earlier, these men were considered property. Now, Hiram Revels, born to free Black parents in North Carolina, was taking the Senate seat once held by Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy. And he wasn't alone in this. Blanche K. Bruce, a man born into slavery in Virginia, would join Revels as the second Black U.S. Senator. For the first time in American history, Black citizens were helping write the nation's laws from its highest chambers of power. But beneath this facade of progress, the South was already plotting its revenge. See, the plantation owners had a problem. Their entire economy was built on slave labor. And now that slavery was technically illegal, they needed to find creative solutions. Their first move? Take advantage of the fact that most freed slaves couldn't read. Former slave owners would present these elaborate labor contracts to freedmen, claiming they were fair employment agreements. In reality, these contracts often included conditions that were basically slavery with extra steps. Workers could be locked in cells at night, chained up, forbidden from leaving the property, forced to speak in a servile manner, and accept whatever punishment their employer deemed necessary. Perhaps no one described this brutal transition better than Patsy Mitchner, a former slave interviewed in 1937. Here's what she said.
I got to stop it for a minute, y'all. I got to stop it. You see what the key was to bring them back? It still exists today in the entertainment industry. The contract. The lack of knowledge about contracts. Contractual agreements that you have to abide by. When you think about the music industry and what people first complain about is the contract. Everybody is disgruntled about the contract because we're not knowledgeable about the contract. And that's what they used then because people couldn't read. Nowadays, people still don't like to read. It's not intriguing for people to read. People do not want to read. When reading is what they say about if you want to hide something from a black man, man, let me keep playing the video before I get to tripping.
Slavery was a bad thing, and freedom, of the kind we got with nothing to live on, was bad. 2 snakes full of poison, one lying with his head pointing north, the other with his head pointing south. Their names were slavery and freedom. Both bit the Negro, and they were both bad. But this was just the beginning. Across the South, state legislatures were passing what they called black codes, laws that looked neutral on paper, but were designed specifically to trap Black Americans in a new kind of bondage. Then came 1876. The presidential election split the country, with Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden both claiming victory. Southern Democrats saw their opportunity. They struck a deal. They would accept Hayes as president on one condition. All federal troops had to leave the South. And just like that, The Black Americans that tasted freedom that was rightfully theirs were now facing the threat of slavery again, only under a different banner. And let me be real for a second. This video only scratches the surfaces of the horrors of this system. If you're interested in learning the whole story, check out Douglas Blackmon's book, Slavery by Another Name, a detailed telling of the horrors of convict leasing and debt peonage. Click the link down below in the description to find it. In 1877, Hayes ordered the last federal troops to withdraw, and that was the end of the radical Reconstruction era. And for Black Americans, this was again the beginning of a nightmare. With federal troops gone, Southern states were free to enforce their black codes with impunity. These weren't just some Jim Crow segregation laws. No, these were carefully crafted legal traps designed to criminalize Black existence itself. Take something as simple as getting to work. The South's road system was primitive, so the easiest way to travel was along railroad tracks. But for Black citizens, that was now trespassing. Try to hop on a freight train without a ticket? That's another crime. Even carrying a razor in your pocket, something any barber or working man might need, could land you in chains. And once you were arrested, the system was designed to ensure conviction. Black citizens had no right to legal representation. They faced all white juries. By 1890, the results were staggering. In Alabama's coal mining region, a survey of convicts showed the most common crimes were things like carrying a concealed weapon, gambling, using offensive language, and the biggest catch-all, vagrancy, the crime of being unemployed. And this was all created for profit. Remember all of those Confederate business owners who lost their slave labor? They'd found a new source, convict leasing. Let's look at the Chattahoochee Brick Company in Atlanta. Under the scorching Georgia sun, convict laborers were forced to produce 300,000 bricks every single day. The work was so brutal that children were specifically chosen for certain tasks. Their small bodies could fit inside the smoking hot kilns. The company's owner, James W. English, was a former Confederate officer who became one of Atlanta's wealthiest men through this system. In Alabama's coal mines, it was even worse. The Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company worked their convict laborers to death. Literally. The Coalburg mine had an annual death rate of 30%, meaning if you sentenced 100 men to work there, 30 would be dead within a year. That's one death every 12 days. And unlike slave owners who had financial incentive to keep their human property alive, these companies could simply request more convicts to replace the dead.
The key word, we get ready to break down some of the things that really caught my attention. You know, this is a learning experience for me. This is educational for me. He said, sentenced to work there. Not sentenced to prison, sentenced to jail. Sentenced to work. So in the contractual agreement, it was a certain period of time that you had to work. And if you didn't work, vagrancy, which is Black unemployment, was a crime. To not work was a crime. That's sick, dawg. That's sick. As of recently, since President Trump got back into the office, he said something to the migrants and the people from other countries that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment was used for the slaves. He was right. Not saying that what he said was honorable or was morally right or correct, but he was right. We looking in this video, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment was for Black people. Now, the migrants is trying to use that amendment, the birthright amendment, so they can stay over here. If you have kids or whatever, you can stay over here. That was specifically meant for Black people. And you know what's crazy? These amendments and these things in the Constitution or whatever still exist today. That 13th Amendment, you still a slave if you commit a crime, is crazy. Because you got to think about it's 2025. It's brothers that's working for a quarter hour in prison. You know, the California wildfires just happened. They had just as many prisoners working to stop those fires as they did employees. That's cheap labor. Slavery in America, slaves in America has never been freed. Slavery still exists through the financial system, through capitalism. It's a top and a bottom. It's needed, man, for capitalism to work. Let me finish what I said. It's needed for capitalism to work. Slavery has never ended, and now it ain't just slavery for black people. Even though those amendments was meant for black people, it's for all people. If you commit a crime, you are a slave. You might have a better opportunity of beating the charge if you white or Caucasian or whatever, or getting up out of a situation. But if you are poor or white, you still a slave, according to the 13th Amendment. Another thing that caught my attention, I didn't know what that meant, and I Googled it for y'all, and I'm going to read it to y'all. Radical Reconstruction. So the AI overview says, was a period of Reconstruction policies that took place after the American Civil War. The policies were intended to give African Americans full equality and create a multiracial society. That's what it was meant for. So the key actions: military districts. The South was divided into military districts. New constitutions. Southern states were required to adopt new constitutions. Black suffrage. Black suffrage was introduced. Amendments. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments was passed. An amendment is an addition to the contract. Freedmen's Bureau was re-empowered. I don't know what Freedmen's Bureau is. I'm going to have to do my research on that. Economic development. Funding was provided for railroads and other enterprises. Public schools. The South's first state-funded public schools were established. Taxation. More equitable taxation legislation was passed. Public transportation. Laws were passed against racial discrimination in public transportation. So after it says all of that, it says the significance of this radical reconstruction was a large-scale experiment in interracial democracy. It led to the most progressive state constitution in the region's history. Radical Reconstruction took place from 1867 through 1872. It was a response to the election of November 6, 1866. You know what's crazy when I think about that? The Civil Rights Bill. And we talk about things that happened 100 years after that. They was trying to integrate 100 years before Martin Luther King Jr. with radical reconstruction. Let's continue to look at the video, and let me be quiet so we can continue to learn, y'all. Appreciate y'all for tuning in.
But perhaps the most insidious part of this system is that it worked exactly as designed. By the 1890s, the myth of black criminality had spread far beyond the South. Remember how Northerners before the Civil War described black Americans? Words like loyal, dutiful, reliable. But by century's end, the narrative had completely changed. Instead, they now used words like brute, thug, and savages to describe black people. Proof that the horrible lost cause narrative had managed to craft an image of black people that was villainous and barbaric. By 1900, the system had achieved its goal. The same Southern industrialists who once bought slaves were now leasing convicts for pennies a day. The same racial hierarchy that slavery once maintained was now preserved through a new system of legal slavery. In Alabama's 1890 survey, even the official records reveal the absurdity. 11 convicts for false pretense, which meant quitting your job. 7 for the crime of interracial relationships, and 24 for using obscene language. Think about this. Today, if you're arrested, you face a trained judge in a formal courtroom. But in the South after 1877, your fate was decided by what they called a justice of the peace. And this could be your local innkeeper, tailor, or grocery store owner, suddenly having the power to sentence you to prison. These were regular townspeople, often plantation owners themselves, who were basically given a side job of playing judge. It's like if your boss could also arrest you and declare you guilty of a crime. In Alabama, records show that the largest category of convict laborers was listed simply as not given. They didn't even bother writing down the supposed crime. The system was so blatantly corrupt that in 1890, when the state surveyed convicts in the Pratt mines, they found people imprisoned for crimes like selling cotton after sunset or speaking too loudly in the presence of white women. The message was clear. They didn't need a real crime to put you in chains. And once they had you, they put you to work into building the new industrial South. In Georgia, convicts produced the bricks that literally rebuilt Atlanta. In Alabama, they mined the coal that fueled America's steel industry. In Florida, they harvested turpentine from pine trees. In Texas, they cut the sugarcane. And all the while, Northern newspapers began repeating Southern narratives about Black criminality. Before the Civil War, Northern whites had generally viewed Black Americans as hardworking and reliable. But now, the image transformed into what one paper called a lascivious beast roaming the country. By 1915, when D.W. Griffith released Birth of a Nation, the narrative transformation was complete. The film portrayed the Confederacy's defeat as a tragedy and the Klan as heroes protecting society from supposedly violent Black men. President Woodrow Wilson even screened it at the White House, calling it history written with lightning. The film's impact went beyond propaganda. The Klan, which had been effectively destroyed in the 70s, saw a massive revival. The movie even invented their most famous symbol, the burning cross, which the original Klan had never used. Meanwhile, the convict leasing system had become so profitable that by 1898, nearly 73% of Alabama's entire state revenue came from leasing convicts. Major corporations like U.S. Steel were building their fortunes on this forced labor. The system was so brutal that even former slave owners admitted it was worse than slavery. After all, slaves were expensive property worth protecting, but convict laborers could simply be replaced when they died. But if you think the system died out with the Victorian era, you're in for a shock. Because in the 20th century, it was about to expand into something even more sinister. And this time, it wouldn't just be the South doing it. By the way, if you've enjoyed the content so far and would like to see more untold Black stories, go ahead and click the subscribe button down below. It would mean the world to us and help spread our message.
Salute to this channel, though. Before we further along with the video or whatever, I'm a fan of this channel, Black Stories Untold. Go ahead and subscribe to their channel and check them out, man, because they're releasing some phenomenal content over there, and I'm very appreciative that I'm allowed to use their video to spark up conversation, because we about to talk about this convict leasing and this convict laborer, because some of these people, to me, wasn't or was all of them convicts committing crimes, and what was the crimes that they was committing that sentenced them to be a laborer? Like, just because you was unemployed, the word vagrancy that they use, Black unemployment. So you could be white and unemployed and it wasn't a crime. But if you was Black and unemployed, it was a crime. So you was a convict and now you have to work for lower labor wages. This is demonic at the end of the day.
By the dawn of the 20th century, what started as a Southern scheme had grown into a massive industrial operation. The numbers are staggering. Over 800,000 people were caught in this system of neo-slavery. That's 1/5 of all the people who had been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, now trapped in a new form of bondage. Think about that for a second. The South had literally re-enslaved 20% of the people who were supposed to be free. And they did it all completely legally. So how were they able to do all of this at such an unprecedented scale? Let's use the story of John Davis from Alabama. In 1901, Davis was just walking down a road, trying to reach his dying wife's bedside. But a crooked local constable claimed Davis owed him money. That was all it took. Davis never made it to see his wife. Instead, He became another cog in what became known as the debt peonage system. This system was built on deception. You'd be arrested on some trumped up charge, maybe vagrancy because you were walking on a railroad track, or gaming because you were caught playing dice. The justice of the peace, as we talked about before, was usually in on the scheme. He'd find you guilty and impose a massive fine. But don't worry, some kind white plantation owner or industrialist would step in and offer to pay your fine if you signed a contract to work it off.
Let me stop it for a moment because I want to read something. Whew, that was loud. What comes to mind right now is that anybody watching this episode, I'm going to do the studies myself though, but I want to know, the percentage of black men that is in prison today that is considered slaves, that's working for a slave labor in prison. I want to know the percentage. I need to know the percentage of black men that's in prison right now. Because like when I think about it, this is all a setup. It's all a setup. It's still going on today. We're not free today. I think about the women and what they have to go through now. And the women focused on education and black women being the most people in the country getting degrees now. And they're left without their men because their men is in prison. Majority of them is in prison. It's still a slave system. It's kind of better, but if you participate in anything that is considered a crime and you're not obeying the laws of the land, you can go right back into the slave. You can go right back into it. Might not pay your taxes. That's a crime. It's just interesting, man. This is interesting, and this is a crazy strategic way to control people that you don't like, that you don't think is human beings. So let me read this. The AI overview of what a convict lease system is. The convict lease system was a practice of forcing prisoners to work for private companies. It's still going on today. This is crazy. They call it that? The convict lease system was a practice of forcing prisoners to work for private companies without pay. Oh, they are paying though today. Without pay in exchange for a fee from the state. It was a form of slavery that existed in the southern United States after the Civil War until the 20th century. How it worked. The state leased prisoners to private companies like plantations, mines, and railways. The state saved money by not having to pay for the prisoners' food and housing. The private companies benefited from cheap labor. Prisoners faced dangerous, inhumane, and often deadly work conditions. The impact. The convict leasing system was a major source of income for many southern state governments. It was a continuation of slavery, and many view it as slavery by another name. It was racially biased, with African Americans being disproportionately affected. Abolishing. The convict lease system was formally abolished during the 20th century. However, some say that the legal structures that enable convict leasing still exist today.
They didn't tell you was that every bit of food they fed you, every scrap of clothing they gave you, every night's lodging, it all got added to your debt. The more you worked, the more you somehow owed. People would end up working for years trying to pay off what started as a $10 fine. Warren Reese, a federal prosecutor who investigated these operations, described it perfectly in 1903. These violations have not been confined to one or two periodical and independent instances, but it has developed into a miserable business and custom to catch up ignorant and helpless Negro men and women upon the flimsiest and most baseless charges. The victims would be placed into a condition of involuntary servitude, locked up at nights in a cell, worked under guards during the day from 3 o'clock in the morning until 7 or 8 o'clock at night, whipped in a most cruel manner, insufficiently fed or poorly clad. And if someone tried to escape, dogs would be set on their trail. When caught, they'd face even worse treatment. As their contract neared its end, they'd suddenly be arrested again on new charges, starting the cycle all over. And that was how those major corporations like U.S. Steel and Tennessee Coal were able to do what they did. When companies were finally brought to court, they had a brilliant defense. They argued that since the debts they used to hold workers were fictitious, this wasn't debt peonage at all, it was slavery. And incredibly, this defense worked. Because while the 13th Amendment had abolished slavery, it hadn't made it a crime. And so, the system continued, decade after decade, becoming more entrenched in the American industry. It would take something completely unexpected to finally bring it down. December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, which forces America into World War II. But as President Roosevelt gathered his cabinet to discuss the coming war, he faced an uncomfortable question. What would the enemy use against the United States in the propaganda war? The answer was obvious: America's treatment of black citizens. How could the U.S. claim moral superiority over how Japan was treating the Chinese or Koreans when we had our own subjugated underclass? Just 5 days after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's Justice Department issued Circular 3591. This memo completely changed how prosecutors would approach these cases. For decades, attempts to prosecute these practices had failed because companies would argue it wasn't debt peonage. Now, the Justice Department told prosecutors to stop calling it peonage and start calling it what it was: involuntary servitude and slavery. The memo unleashed a wave of prosecutions across the country. Within months, dozens of cases were opened. But out of all of them, one case would mark the final chapter of this dark history. In September 1942, on a farm outside of Beeville, Texas, federal agents discovered a man named Alfred Irving. He had been held as a slave by the Skrobarczyk family for at least 4 years. They had starved him, beaten him with chains, whips, and ropes until he was permanently disfigured. The family was found guilty and sent to federal prison. And just like that, with the conviction of the Skrobarczyk family, Alfred Irving became the last chattel slave to be freed in America. Not an indentured servant, not a convict laborer, not a debt peon, but a slave in every sense of the word.
I'm gonna pause it for a moment because some things need to be said. Kind of losing my voice already, man. Uh, you know, when I think about the structure of America and how the government and the Caucasians obtained their power, I think they used it. I don't think, I know. They used violence and fear tactics to obtain their power, and they still use it today. I feel as if African Americans will eventually get reparations for slavery, but it won't be reparations that is going to be life changing and beneficial to us, knowing that we deserve it. Everything that they do, even what he just spoke about, is in the benefit of them. When he talked about Pearl Harbor and how the Japanese would use black people against them because of how we've been treated for so long, the only reason that that man was freed and those other people were sentenced to jail was for the benefit of how they want to be viewed. When we get reparations, it will be for their benefit of how they want to be viewed. And if we don't have a plan and organize on how to use it for the benefit of us, the interests of us, the 40 million or more of us that it is, then we ain't gonna do nothing but spend it right back with them and put it back in their pockets. That's all that's gonna be done. Real talk. Let's continue to listen to the video, man. This right here is starting to make me angry, to be honest with you, because they obtained their power through violence and fear tactics. And I wasn't alive back then. Right now, we living in a real soft, cushiony time, and it's making us more soft. And this is really upsetting.
Think about that timeline for a moment. The last slave in America wasn't freed in 1865, they were freed in 1942. To put that into perspective, Joe Biden was born just 2 months later, and even then, the fight was far from over. Decades later, and Black Americans still had to drink from separate water fountains. Segregation wouldn't end until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 finally allowed Black citizens to vote again. But just a few years after that, President Nixon launched his war on drugs, which would disproportionately target and imprison Black Americans on purpose. By an ironic twist of history, it took the threat of German propaganda to end one system of forced labor in America. But another system was already waiting to take its place, the modern prison industrial complex. But that's for another video. So, when did slavery really end in America? The history books will tell you it's 1865, but the truth is, the last slave wasn't freed until 1942. It's not ancient history, that's within living memory. And before Black Americans could even process this trauma, the system was already evolving. Here's what Nixon's domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, later admitted about the war on drugs. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with and Blacks with and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. See the pattern? From the slave codes to the Black codes to the war on drugs. It's a continuum of oppression against Black Americans. The methods change, but the results stay the same.
Thank y'all for tuning in to my show, man. I'm going to put a link in the description for y'all to watch that in its entirety. You can see right now that it's nothing but 4 minutes left, but I think that this was a very educational conversation. I would like to further the discussion in the comment section with you guys. Are we free? Are we still slaves? Talk to me, man. I appreciate everybody that tunes into my show. Like I always say, peace, love, plenty, abundance. Make sure you go get you some money, and I'm gone.
The Trevor Jackson Podcast.